Hello, my name is Hannah Ayres and I am a second year PhD student studying sociology at the University of Warwick. For the first half of this podcast, I will introduce the terms queer, queer theory and queer pedagogy. I will then discuss why it is important to consider gender diversity in the classroom, and throughout I will be discussing case study examples that I collected for Warwick International Higher Education Academy when I helped write guidance on gender inclusive teaching. So queer originally was used to describe anything strange or different. As Sarah Ahmed says, queer to describe anything that is noticeable because it was odd. It was co-opted as a term of abuse, mainly directed at those not seen as fitting the norm, for example those with same-sex desires and or those who were viewed as gender non-conforming. In the late 1980s, activists sought to reclaim the term queer from its abusive roots. In this way, queer became a political identity as well as an overarching term over the use of LGBT. Queer theory, developed in the 1990s, would then sought to critically develop the use of the term and uses queer more as something that is done. It's a theoretical approach to question the categories and assumptions on which popular and academic understandings are based. Queer can be used as a term to disrupt and to dismantle the dynamics of power and privilege. It can be also used to represent that which defies the norm. So in essence, queer can represent a singular identity, a catch-all term, and a force that's meant to disrupt and trouble established knowledge bases. Queer as a term can be contradictory and divisive, so it can produce interesting results when applied to pedagogical practice. So queer pedagogy is an incredibly difficult thing to try and define. Mostly, this is because rather than being a set of written rules, it will look differently for the individual educators and can even perform differently from session to session. There are, however, some pointers I can give on what queer pedagogy is and how you can begin to implement it as an educator. First of all, queer pedagogy works to disrupt a classroom and individuals' points of view. This can be done by challenging heteronormative and cisgendered assumptions, and later I'll be discussing more concrete ways that this can be done. An example of this is when Dr. Maeve Harding discussed two modules with me, one that focused on family law and stated that they should look to challenge the assumptions in English family law that centered around heteronormative assumptions of family life. Whilst queer theory and thus queer pedagogy has primarily been concerned with sexuality and gender, the principles can work to disrupt any area of study. In this way, queer pedagogy can refer to, quote, the deliberate production of queer relations and to the production of subjectivities as deviant performance. So when queering pedagogy this way, it's important to remember that it's not about getting the right answer, but about allowing students to think critically and engage in discussions that might challenge held beliefs. So another layer to queer pedagogy, which might sound a bit counterintuitive to what I've just said, is the ability to allow for students, particularly queer students, to feel included. It's about creating a space for students to challenge one another's assumptions. So inclusion for queer students can look different in every instance, but one of the ways that this is possible is the act of coming out. If possible and safe for educators to do so, potentially they can reveal to the students that they identify as queer individuals themselves. So according to the University of Birmingham's LGBTQ inclusivity in higher education guidance, students significantly benefit from having identifiable role models. This can be evidenced by one of the case studies provided by Dr. Anna Heikover. When I studied, there was no queer faculty. I only had my first queer professor as a grad student, and that was really important to me. I thematicized my queerness frequently to make clear to the students that there are ways of life beyond heteronormativity. I'm told by some of my queer students that this is pretty important to them, but it's also crucial for the straight ones because it normalizes non-heteronormative lifestyles in their world. So whilst in some cases it's possible to promote discussions around gender identity and or sexuality in teaching, this might not always be possible. Dr. Gerald Sharplin gave the advice to talk about your life as one normally would in a professional classroom situation. It's really important to remember that if you do this, to be patient as students might be curious and have questions. So one thing to remember when querying pedagogy is that this is often a difficult and uncomfortable process. Introducing queer ways of knowing can provide opportunities and broadens what can be achieved, but as Whitlock states, this is not in some baselessly hopeful way, but in hard-grueling and playful ways. So taking this idea further, Alexander in particular advocates for purposefully introducing discomfort into classrooms in order to promote discussion and to ensure the comfort of some students does not exclude others from participating. Along similar lines, I really love this quote from Bryson and Castell, as they advocate for imperfect outcomes. Of queering its techniques and scribbling graffiti over its texts, of colouring outside the lines so as to deliberately take the wrong route on the way to school, going in an altogether different direction than that specified by a monologic destination. As can be seen, queer pedagogy often means holding this discomfort, which can be a difficult task but can also be extremely rewarding. So queer pedagogy, as has been alluded to, can also be extremely emotive. For some disciplines, this can be at odds with the world of academia, often heralded as an objective fountain of knowledge. So when discussing emotion in the classroom, we're not always discussing positive emotions. As Alexander states, higher education institutions privilege students' enjoyment and engagement, while students' experience of supposedly negative affect, sorrow, shame, embarrassment, are viewed as signs that instructors have failed to do their jobs properly. As previously discussed, queering pedagogy can be difficult and uncomfortable, but a classroom should provide a space to work through emotions, both positive, negative, and ambivalent. Dr. Kath Lambert, in her module Ways of Knowing, Gender Bodies, Power, uses emotions to explore different ways of knowing and invites students to push the boundaries of what they recognize as knowledge and explore ways of knowing that are marginal in academia but central to everyday social life, such as embodied experiences, political activity, or artistic practice. This module takes this idea of emotive classroom experience and forefronts these, privileging the students to push against the boundaries of what is expected in academia. Whilst this is not always possible in such an obvious way in all classrooms, it's important to ensure we don't shut students down as educators and instead encourage students to explore their reactions in relation to what's being discussed. So before discussing this topic, I want to first begin with a quote from Kate Borstein, as I believe this advocates for why gender is important to consider in general. So try this. Imagine the world as a place where anyone can safely and even joyfully express themselves in ways they've always wanted to. Nothing about the bodies they were born with, or what they choose to do with those bodies, how they dress them or decorate or trim or augment them, would get people laughed at, or targeted, or in any way deprived of their rights. Can you imagine a world like that? So implementing a queer pedagogy can be utilised to help create a more inclusive environment for trans and gender diverse students. This work is important as many trans and gender diverse students feel unrepresented in their classrooms and thus unsupported by educators. This creates feelings of isolation and loneliness, and a study conducted by the National Union of Students indicated that 1 in 2 trans respondents had seriously considered dropping out of their course. There's evidence that a number of trans and gender diverse students also feel unsafe at university, detailing high levels of negative comments and conduct from both staff and students. So thus, it's really important to instill a culture that allows students and staff to remain informed on topics of gender, and one that allows trans and gender diverse students to feel comfortable and included in their chosen discipline. So there's a few more concrete suggestions I can make that could allow trans and gender diverse students to feel included by students and staff. So assuming how somebody identifies can lead to the use of incorrect pronouns and gendered language when referring to them. It can be really easy to do this. For example, educators may choose to call on students by referring to the gender that they assume that student identifies as. For example, calling on the lady in the front. It's incredibly important to ensure that you do not assume somebody's gender identity, as this can be damaging for students and make them feel really excluded. Dr. Rick Crossman gave an alternative to the example I just mentioned. Quote, "I've adopted a policy I encountered at a convention a few years ago, and I make sure that when I identify a student in a lecture, I do so by clothing, location, hair color, accessories, etc. It's also really important to note that many individuals take time to reach a level of comfort with their gender identity and any other identities that they hold, so it's important to approach teaching with an assumption of diversity. It's also important to note that although an individual may identify as trans or gender diverse, it's then vital to not assume their sexuality.
In practice, an educator may limit their vocabulary by only referring to two genders, for example, boy, girl, man, woman, etc., or infer that there are only two genders. Educators might also reflect this binary understanding in their practice by, for example, dividing groups by gender and providing only two gender options when collecting data. Gender is much more complicated than this, and there are a growing number of gender identities that one might identify as. It's important to reflect this diversity in practice and the language used. In certain disciplines and subjects, this binary can potentially even be challenged and disrupted. For example, Nick Cherryman provides an example of this. So I deliberately wore heels to highlight the point that items are gendered by the observer, rather than being innately gendered. The heels were 5.5-inch stilettos, red PV, with a rubber sole and a small metal buckle. None of these items are gendered reading onto the materials. In wearing male passing clothes and presenting as masculine, but then disrupting this with items that refocus the attention elsewhere, it subverted, queered perhaps, the expectations of the viewer. So it's important that you ensure to refer to students by their chosen name in all circumstances. Some trans and gender diverse individuals do not legally change their name immediately, and others may have no intention of doing so ensure to communicate with students to find out how they would like to be addressed. It's not appropriate to ask trans and gender diverse individuals what their name was before transitioning or choosing a different name. Another way to incorporate gender diversity into a classroom is to choose gender-neutral names when presenting examples. Dr. Rick Crossman presents an example of this. So one of the examples in the decision theory module I taught involved two people deciding where to go on a date. The original names of the couples made it clear that they were a boy and a girl, but I changed these to more gender-neutral names. As well as respecting chosen names, it's really important to respect preferred pronouns. There are many ways to ask politely for someone's pronouns, and introducing yourself with yours can allow students to feel open and comfortable to tell you theirs. Some students may still feel uncomfortable doing this, especially when they don't know you very well, and so allowing students to write down on a piece of paper their name and preferred pronoun, or asking students to email you, can be more private and less daunting. It's important not to out a student that is trans or gender diverse, as this may not be something that's widely known by others and could cause them to face discrimination. If you only have a short interaction with the student, or if you didn't get a chance to find out their pronouns, using the gender-neutral they will usually work as a default until you can. If you make a mistake, then it's really key not to draw too much attention to it, as this can cause an individual discomfort, so simply apologize and move on. So it's important not to tolerate anti-trans remarks, behavior, or humor that invalidates others' gender identities. It can be difficult to know how to deal with this, as students might be unaware of the harm they're causing. Depending on how an educator thinks is best to deal with this, the discrimination can be used as a point of discussion in class, or can be done privately. So ensure to speak to students affected if you're aware of who they are, to ensure that they know that the behavior has been dealt with, and to make them aware of the channels they can use if they experience anything else like this. Make sure not to email students, as this can feel really impersonal and emails might be misconstrued or ignored. So when bringing gender debates explicitly into the classroom, it should be acknowledged that students come from all different backgrounds and so have wildly differing understandings of gender and gender identities. Students should be prepared and made aware before the class what will be discussed. A notice should be made in advance to emphasize that students come from different places of knowledge and to respect everybody in the room. This statement of respect should be emphasized in class to let students know what is expected of them. Potentially, students that identify as trans or gender diverse could talk to the class about what a discussion around gender means to them, but only if they're comfortable, and this must be done with advance notice and the student's explicit consent. To conclude, I will say that language and discussions around gender and gender identity are ever evolving. In the UK, a consultation happened in 2018 that focused on the reformation of the Gender Recognition Act 2004, which may result in changes to the law, so it's really important to keep up to date.